Dear delegates, it's my proud privilege to introduce our next eminent speaker of the day, Dr. Nafis Faizi sir, Assistant Professor in Department of Community Medicine, JN Medical College, with research experience in health system, global health policy, HIV/AIDS, adolescent and mental health. Sir will be presenting on the topic developing research questionnaire and framing objectives. Over to you, sir.
Hi, everyone. I hope I'm audible. Okay, so in today's session, what we'll do is we'll talk about how to develop research questions and frame objectives. If anyone has a problem in understanding me anywhere, please stop me if you do not. Okay. So what we'll do today, before I even begin, I have some conflicts of interest in declarations, but I do not have any financial interest in any of the editorial positions I have, notably in global public health. And my membership or trainer experience is with multiple organizations, but none of them is financial in nature, except for training fundings that are there. So let's start with how we do research all over the world. So this is a famous cartoon that appears in PhD comics, is where people write the paper and then fit it into a research topic. And this is something that we actually do in principle. What we'll talk about today is in terms of research questions and framing objectives. We'll be talking about what these are, how do we do it, how do we create a research question. We'll see a couple of examples. And I'll also be forwarding you a couple of reading materials for the same. Then we'll talk about how do we reach the objectives from the research question. Finally, I'll have a snapshot of what not to do and just one question at the end. So let's start with what are we talking about in terms of research question and framing objectives. Now, this is how we do research. So generally, we have a big, broad area, and in that big, broad area, we are interested. For example, if somebody is interested in diabetes, they start researching on its various aspects. And then through literature search and through current trends, we find out that this is a particular problem area, for example. Now, once you find the problem area, for example, let's say that there is some hypoglycemic drug that has different kind of compliance or different kind of efficacy in younger patients than older patients. You realize that this is a problem through some of the research. Now, through that, you try to finesse, make it finer, and make an exact research question of the definitive problem. After you've made a research question, you frame a hypothesis in some studies. And through hypothesis, after stating the hypothesis, you have one or more objectives, which are smart, and through which you want to do your research. The research question usually is of two types. One type of research question has hypothesis testing involved, and they are of two types of designs: analytical design and experimental design. Clinical trials are clearly an experimental design. However, the analytical designs also have a hypothesis. For example, is the prevalence of diabetes more in urban area than rural area? There could be a hypothesis for that. Or if government-funded medical colleges have better empathy in their undergraduate students than private-funded medical colleges. This could be a hypothetical analytical study. You can't do an experiment on those. So analytical and experimental study designs are there for hypothesis testing. Sometimes we don't even need that. We only need an estimate. So we do descriptive studies to estimate that. So for example, the need of a particular vaccine in a population, you need an exact estimate. That could be descriptive. You don't need hypothesis in every study design. Okay. There's another term that is often confused before we go ahead to research question is what is research aim and what is research objective? Now, research aim is generic. And the study is generally framed as aim. So, for example, what is to be achieved? If you are answering what, then that is aim. The presentation of aim, and because it is very generic, is a very big, broad paragraph or a single sentence, which broadly, tells you the purpose of the whole study. This is something that you would say to a newbie who is walking in your corridor and suddenly asks, "What are you doing these days?" So you don't want to explain the nitty-gritty of the details. You just say the aim of the study, that look, this is what I'm trying to do. However, the objectives are specific, okay? And it specifies how can it be achieved. So it's not only what, it's also how. The objectives, and any aim can have multiple objectives. All of the objectives should be numbered, and all of the objectives should be as much as possible smart. And I'll be talking about this in greater detail in a while from now. So that is about aim and objectives. And now, before I even go ahead, I'll keep on using these acronyms, and these are very important and useful acronyms. And so that we stay on the same page on how do we frame objectives, let's, for the uninitiated, let's look at these terms. So finer is a term that we use, an acronym that we use for what? I don't know whether I can ask questions or not. I don't know. So finer is something that we use for what? Research questions, objectives, where do we use it? I wonder if
you can answer in the third one.
you can answer in your chat box, and it would be interesting to know how do you think about it. Why is finer important? Finer, F stands for feasible, I for interesting, N for novel, E for ethical, and R for relevant. When we say feasibility, that does not mean that you'll do what is feasible, as we often do in some of our MD or master degree dissertations all across board. That this is feasible, therefore do it. Feasibility here means that this is an interesting question. How do I make it feasible? Rather than this is a feasible question, therefore I should do it. So feasibility means how do you make things feasible in the problem that you have. The second thing is interesting. The meaning of interesting could be very different for different people. So for example, I'll give you just one example. I was in a journal club a couple of years ago in an Obs and Gynae department, where in the SWOT analysis of the journal club, I said that if this IUD continues to be used, one must say what are the weaknesses of this, because it is economically, the economic bearing, the cost is very high, and therefore, it's not wise to recommend this when it does not have a superlative advantage over the other. Now, the gynecologist told me that we are not worried about it. So I said, why? And they said, we are not worried because government provides us for free. And they said, that's very interesting. Whether government purchases it or we purchase it, the point is the same. In fact, if the government is purchasing it, it should also be, it should be a bigger problem, because then there are millions of monies from a ministry to be wasted without any distinctive advantage. So interesting is depending on people, how you see it, how your ideologies are constructed. Novel is something new, something different. Is it adding to the strengthening? Is it strengthening the evidence base, or is it adding something new to the evidence base? Again, it should be ethical and it should be relevant. So that is what finer means. Okay, Anand is asking how many objectives can we have in one study? I'll come up to that, Anand. Don't you worry about it. Finer is used to define our research questions. Just remember that from me. The second thing is PICOT, PICO, PECO. There are other forms of it, where now what you do is you have your fine research question, but now you want to go further and define how you're going to do it. So the first thing that you think about is P, that is population of interest. You think about the intervention that you're doing in clinical trials. If you're doing an analytical study, you're thinking of exposures. C is for comparison group. Who are you going to compare it to? In our cities, you usually have a control group, a placebo group, or a dummy drug group. Then there are outcomes. In clinical trials, you have different type of outcomes, primary outcomes, secondary outcomes, so on and so forth. So PICOT, T is for time. So finer research questions are then used in our research design to define the PICOT principle. And once we've done that, then we are in a position to now think about the objectives. Now, objectives are tick-based within this whole tree. Okay, so this was your tree of aim. There you had some branches, which is big research questions, specific ones. For each research question, you had your own PICOT principle. And now you're distinctly saying, this is my objective within this particular research question. So the question's answer is that within one research question, you could have multiple objectives. It depends on the research question, how broad it is. With that kind of background, I'll move to the next part, and the more important part of my presentation is how do we do it? How do we frame the research question? Let us see some active examples and go on through a stepwise method. Okay? This is a common comics that is used, that just because you're using Isaac Newton's pen, your thesis would not be as brilliant as Isaac Newton's pen thesis. So that is something that we often think, that you just copy and paste a particular approach in order to learn, and then you think that it would be equally brilliant. That never happens. Before I also go ahead, let me give you two very big statements. I'm a fan of both these statements. One is Hali et al. This finer that you see, FINER, this mnemonic was given by Hali et al.'s paper. Now, Hali et al. Said that the challenge in searching for research question is not a shortage of uncertainties. There are many uncertainties. There are many things to do. The challenge is, the difficulty is in finding the important one, which is feasible and also valid. So there are lots of uncertainties. But what is the uncertainty that is valid and feasible? How can you choose that? And the second is my personal favorite, Peter Medawar, 1967, a great immunologist, is known mostly because of his statement that research is the art of the soluble, which means research means what you can do. There are hundreds of things that can be done, that should be done. Are you able to make it soluble and then do the research? If you can, then you're living a good life as a researcher. If you cannot, and there are many of us, many of the academicians that I see, that they are not even excited about their research even after publication. And that is because they do not know the research of the art of the soluble. I don't know who is doing these annotations. Okay, somebody is trying to, yeah. Okay, let's see a stepwise approach. This is not a standard stepwise approach. This is something that I follow. It works very, very well. Back in ICMR, a lot of people became fan, a lot of PhD students became fan of these steps. And therefore, I often say that use these four. So there are 4 steps. 1, write your starter research question. Anything that you have in your mind, you want to affect diabetes, hypoglycemic drugs, whichever thing, write it down. However crude it may seem, write your starter research question. This is what I'm trying to do. 2, respecify. What does respecify mean? Is now make it specific. To make it specific, use the PICO framework. And I often say that use, Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling had this poem, The Elephant's Child, and it has this very famous statement that I keep 6 honest serving men. Rudyard Kipling could not see women there. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and where and when and how and why and who. So what, where, when, why, how, who. These are the 5 questions. If you can answer and then fit in your research question, that is the first step. Your research question will become specific. What is step 3? Step 3 is a little bit of epidemiology, very little. What is the type of your research question? Is it investigative? Is it descriptive? I'll talk about it. Once you know the type, once you have your specified research question, you then refine and restate the finest research question using the finer principle. So these are the steps, and we'll see these steps in the next few slides with a couple of research questions. If anybody has any problem anywhere, please feel free to drop down on the chat and then we can take that. Okay. So step 3 is type of research question. And generally, there are 4 types of research questions, basically. The first type is exploratory, where you want to know something, how satisfied are medical teachers with the new NMC curriculum. Now, that kind of exploratory research can be best done through a qualitative method or a mixed method. Okay. There are many case studies that help us do that. Exploratory research was very, very highly prized when COVID started in China. So there you needed exploratory research. Who is it affecting? How is it spreading? Very big, broad questions, and those are exploratory. Generally, after the exploratory question, there's a descriptive question. What is the age at which there is maximum mortality in COVID-19? That's a very specific but a descriptive question. What is the prevalence of something? What is the mean of certain mean satisfaction score among pharmacology teachers in a government medical college? These are all descriptive research. They're done through surveys, through case studies, and also through mixed methods. Then there is an analytical design, which is usually quantitative in medical sciences, and they help us explain something. Okay, so what are the risk factors of poor satisfaction among pharmacology teachers in government medical college? It also helps us test hypothesis. The first hypothesis that I was trying to say is that what are the predictors of poor empathy in private medical college students as compared to government medical college students? And this, depends on a lot of assumptions that I'm making here. It's provocative. I certainly do not mean that there is a difference in empathy. There's no such research that says that there is an empathic difference between private and government medical college. Finally, we have a confirmatory hypothesis, and which is experimental, RCTs, clinical trials. They explain and also confirm hypothesis. So analytical designs usually test hypothesis. And if you look at the design, they are lower down as compared to the RCTs. But sometimes you cannot do an RCT. And analytical is the only thing that you do. I have something on chat. Okay, okay. It's about the annotations. Let's move on. Now that we know the type of research question, let me give you an example. So exploratory research question could be, what are the different modern methods of family planning used in India? Whereas descriptive one is, what is the prevalence of OCP use among women who use modern methods of family planning in India? People always often confuse between, because both these use the term what, but exploratory is usually done when you do not have any body of research, when you do not have a credible body of research, when you are in the blind, when you want to find out that how many could be there. So let's survey everyone. Whereas in descriptive, you kind of have a short list. You have that these 10 are the ones that are being used. Let me find out the exact prevalence. So it's more specific, the descriptive one. In analytical, you go a step further. And in similar line, what predicts the OCP use, age, or pre-existing comorbidities? Now, there is a hypothesis that you can see there. Somebody would say the pre-existing comorbidities predict the OCP use. Somebody could say age could predict the OCP use. And after the end of analytical design, we'll find out whether it is, we can test that hypothesis. What is the confirmatory one? In this case, it's the same, because here you cannot do an experimental study. Okay, here is something where we are using an exposure-based study. You cannot do a research design because you cannot randomly give OCPs to people because of obvious reasons. Because different contraceptives have different side effects and different contraindications. So in this case, analytical and confirmatory are same. Okay. So now we know the 4 steps. Now let us do a simple exercise. We'll start with the research question. We'll re-specify it using Kipling and PICOT. We'll identify the type of our research question and then make a final research question, which would be our final research question. Okay. So starter. I am in Nairobi. Nairobi is Kenya's capital and a very interesting character in Money Heist. And you see, the question is, how many children sleep under bed nets in Nairobi? This is what I was interested in. I wrote that down. I did not hesitate for want of the best research question. I just wrote it down. Now, had it been an offline session, I would have asked, what is the problem with this? But I'll give you about 30 seconds. What is the problem with this research question? For starters, I think it's always a problem to wait. Should we wait or go ahead? Anyway, somebody did right. Children age, excellent. Children age not defined. That is one thing that is there. This is very generic. In fact, if you see, there are multiple problems here. Use PICO and you'll find large area, whole country. It's a city, Nairobi, capital of Kenya. But yes, it can be a large area. It can be a question of feasibility now. Who is doing this research? Is the ministry doing this research? If the ministry is doing, maybe Nairobi is fine. But is a medical college doing it? Then this is not fine. Then they might say that in the vicinity of the medical college or in a particular village. So one must think about the PICO criteria. Let's talk about the population. Children, as Dr. Tabassum wrote, that children is not defined. Anybody can be a children. 0 to 18 is also a children. Which child are we talking about? So the age, the population is not specified. The second thing is the intervention. When we say bed nets, they could mean 100 things. A bed net could mean an insecticidal treated bed net, or a simple bed net, or a long-lasting insecticidal net. They could mean anything. So we are not specifying our intervention. In case of drugs, and this is something that people forget, if you're writing insulin, that's a problem. At what dose? What kind of insulin? In fact, the spirit guidelines say that you must specify the exact name of that formulation with the dose and the duration in your research question itself. So the intervention, which is bed net in this case, must be specified. Again, how many children sleep when? Last night, last evening, last month, average of last month, last year, we don't know that. So we must be also talking about these PICO questions. So that was step 1. We stated a research question. Step 2, started thinking about the PICO. Now, step 3 is what type of research am I going to conduct? Now, what do most of you think when we ask this question? Is this a descriptive or an analytical research? Or could it be both, depending on the direction? And that's a difficult question. What some people say is that research question starter should not be used to define your research design. When you think about the PICO, the age, the area, specificities, then you should also think about what kind of research design is feasible. And therefore, I'll give you an example where this research question starter gets into different research questions depending on our type of research that we want to answer. So for example, our descriptive final research question is, what percentage or proportion of under 5 years children in Nairobi slept under an insecticidal treated net last night? So we've specified a lot of things here. The age is specified, okay? The area is correctly specified. Now we know that Nairobi means full Nairobi. Now your sampling will have to take Nairobi through some sampling method. And what kind of bed net? Insecticidal treated bed net. And when? Last night. And this last night, bed net, all of these would in your protocol be operationally defined as well. So that's a descriptive research question. This could also be an analytical research question where I could have asked, what are the predictors of the use of insecticidal treated net among under 5 years old children in Nairobi? Because we know that 5 years children, usually it's the parents who are putting that into insecticidal treated nets. Every parent wants an insecticidal treated net in Nairobi, but do they have it? Do they have the affordability? When we write our research question starter, we're not sure of what we are writing. So therefore, we must also think and keep on defining. So these are the 4 steps. And I hope this paper, I'll forward it. The organizational team will forward this paper to you. This table is from a paper by Gomez, and it's a super paper where they have this table 1, where if you see, they have seen the type of research question, and through these different structures, they are trying to make a research question. Okay. And this follows those 4 steps in different fashion, because sometimes you want to do a research on let's say validation of scales. So how do you do that? So this is a table that I will not discuss, but I'll forward this paper. The organization team will forward it to you. Okay, let's get ahead and now go to the third part of our presentation, which is from research question to objectives. And I must ask the team on how am I doing with time. I'm doing fine with time, I've been told. And in case you want to ask any question or put it in the chat, please do that, because the moment I start with the objectives, the research question will start going into oblivion. So, okay, let's get ahead from research question to objectives. Now, remember this, the problem statement, for example, what we had, and this is the research process. The problem statement we had was, you know what, the broad problem area is that there is a poor glycemic control in diabetes patients. Somehow this is the broad area that I'm focused on. Now in the broad area, I want into the exact problem. Somebody tells me, I did a literature search, scanned some of the papers, there was a journal club going on, I was in a conference, and there I saw that there is a difference in glycemic control in different age groups. Okay, and there are credible papers on that. Now I am interested now. This is my problem area. I see a window of opportunity. I see a very valid and relevant question that must be answered. I do some more research in terms of literature review, and I come upon a basic question, research question. What is the difference of glycemic control in younger versus older patients? Remember, this is my starter research question. It has not been defined in terms of PICOT or finer. In terms of PICOT, I would then have to specify what do I mean by young, what do I mean by old. I must also say, what do I mean by good glycemic control, measured as HbA1c level or measured as a random blood glucose level. This would also be defined by the feasibility. So if you start thinking about the PICOT, you'll be able to specify through Kipling's questions, who is the young, who is the old, what is the intervention exactly? Are we talking about one particular drug? How will you measure this glycemic control? And then the difference word is there. Now, type of research design is also important here. So, for example, there could be this research question as an analytical or confirmatory design where sitting in an endocrinology OPD, you say that in all the mildly suffering diabetic patients, you started giving a certain drug and started doing an HbA1c level to know if there is a difference. That is a simple question, which is analytical. Or you could do a descriptive question. You go to the endocrinology OPD, find a sample population, define sample population, do a cross-sectional research design, and find out whether there is difference in glycemic control in young and old or not. So there are many ways in which this can be, finalized in that field. What is the objective though? Objective is one part of that research question. Sometimes that one part is sufficient. One research question could have only one objective. And one research question could have multiple objectives also. So now, one of the objectives that I've made is to determine the difference in HbA1c levels in younger patients under 25 years versus older patients more than 60 years after 2 weeks of drug X. So you see that a research question is finer, but even in the finer, that these questions, what, how, when, who, they cannot be answered without using a verb. The objective's power is that it tells you the verb that is used. So determination, or to determine, that is the word that is important. That I'm not interested in knowing whether there is a difference or not. I'm interested in knowing what is the exact difference in HbA1c level in both these patients. So that's how you approach, broad area problem, your research question, and finally the objectives. Now, while you're framing research objectives, there are 3 points that one must remember. One, it should be SMART, which means that it should be specific, should be measurable, it should be attainable, it should be relevant, and it should be time-bound. Second, the action verbs are extremely important. We'll see a small exercise of a few action verbs that we use very frequently. So to investigate, to explore, to ascertain, to compare, and the most common objective action verb that we use and which will never be used is to study. To study XYZ. Study is a very weak action verb. If you're using a word like study, then you don't really have a very pointed objective for your research design. So it's very important that you have a list of verbs that answer different kinds of research questions. And I'll also forward one particular list from Imperial College London with the reading materials the organization will send you about the action verbs. So whenever you're framing your objectives, look at those action verbs. The third is especially important when you have multiple objectives, that they should be stated in logical sequence. Okay. So if you are talking about, let's say, HbA1c level as a glycemic control, and first you talk about glycemic control, then you go on to to the minor detail. So the logical sequence should be from broader to shorter or broader to specific even within the objectives. Let's see some examples of these verbs. So for example, these are the 5 verbs that are to be used in these 5 objectives. We are trying to frame it, and I have a list of verbs which are on the left side. To dash the difference in prevalence of diabetes in urban and rural Aligarh. It's very important that while you're framing these objectives, you also think about the outcome. What am I going to get? Am I going to get a quantitative number or a prevalence or a percentage or a mean? Or am I going to get a qualitative term? You know, to dash the prevalence of diabetes in rural Aligarh, to dash the factors that affect public healthcare utilization in diabetes patients in urban Aligarh. And the 5th one is very similar to the 3rd, to dash the factors that lead to differential healthcare utilization among diabetic patients of urban Aligarh. Now, if you see, you must understand the fact that in logical sequence, 3rd comes before 5. In 3rd, you are saying that I just want to know the factors that affect the public healthcare utilization. But in the 5th one, you are admitting that there is a differential healthcare utilization. I want to know the factors that affect that. If you're writing both of these as a research question, objective, the 3rd should come before 5. And finally, to dash the efficacy of drug X in reducing hypertension. I understand that this is a minor form in the sense that it's not totally smart here. My emphasis here is verb usage. So to dash the efficacy of drug X in reducing hypertension should know what is hypertension. What hypertension are you talking about? 150/90. And which drug X at what dose and at what intervals. It's an online session, so let's answer these. So the first one is to determine the difference in prevalence of diabetes in urban and rural Aligarh. Remember, the word determine, whenever it is used, it means that you will have a quantitative assessment of what we are talking about. Thank you. Whereas when we talk about to estimate the prevalence, you know that prevalence is a percentage, it's a proportion. It's not a quantitative exact term in terms of mean and SD. So here we say to estimate the prevalence. Now what does it mean that we estimate is because we'll do it in a sample, we'll find out the prevalence, we'll give a confidence interval. So for example, 57%, confidence interval 34% to 69%. That is what we find out to estimate the prevalence. Now, 3rd and 5th, I'll see them together to identify the factors that affect public healthcare utilization of diabetes patients in urban Aligarh. So I want to know what are the factors that are actually leading to people going to different centers. There's a government endocrinology center here. There's the medicine OPD. There are multiple medicine practitioners, endocrinology practitioners, the IU practitioners. What are the factors that affect public healthcare utilization in the diabetes patients in urban Aligarh? And the last one is to explore the factors that lead to differential healthcare utilization. In the first one, it was about public healthcare utilization. What are the factors that are affecting? In the last one, we are trying to know people are going to Ayush also. Why are they going there? They know diabetes is difficult. They know that the diagnosis of diabetes has been done by modern medicine practitioners. Why are they going there? To explore some of those factors. And this is some of the research that we do is we keep on thinking that just because it is scientific, people can relate to it because they can see the objective evidence. People relate to stories, and those stories lead to good therapeutic relationships. So there are people who take allopathic drugs, but they keep on singing praises of the one, traditional medicine practitioner because he could tell good stories about that disease, that, this is how it is caused. Anyway, so we have to explore that factors and take into consideration. To evaluate the efficacy of drug X in reducing hypertension is the correct terminology in terms of verb usage in framing the objectives. This is the spirit example. I hope many of you know what spirit is. So there are now checklists and guidelines to write everything. Spirit is the protocol writing guideline for clinical trials, and they are also published now. The spirit example says, and look at the objective, I just wanted to show the objective, is to determine if apixaban is non-inferior to warfarin and the normalized ratio and target range is given. In the combined endpoint of stroke, what is stroke? They define that as well. In subjects with atrial fibrillation, and at least one additional risk factor for stroke. So you see here, the objective is so detailed and so specific that it also has one, the verb usage. Look at the verb usage, determine. Look at the drug apixaban and warfarin, and the target range of both is written. In fact, the hypothesis is also there in the objective, you can see here. Non-inferior. Non-inferior is a word that comes directly from the hypothesis. And these are one of those words. I'm sorry. These are one of those words which make doctors different than the whole population. You know, talk to a journalist and ask them what is non-inferior, and then laugh over you. What is non-inferior? That's called superior, right? But superior and non-inferior are completely different in medical sciences, as is swelling and inflammation, for example. And sometimes we take it for granted, the kind of vocabulary, the kind of specificity that we have in the medical language. So that is that. Let's go ahead. If you have any questions, please put it in the chat box. Finally, I'll just have a couple of slides on what not to do. And this is not an exhaustive list. There are lots of things which you do not have to do. But from my experience, what I've usually found as the commonest errors is something that I'll put forward in research question and objectives. Number one is combining aims and objectives. So a lot of people do that. Now, so for example, this research aims to investigate factors associated with poor treatment compliance and whether alcohol consumption and economic status is associated with it. Complete blunder. Okay. So what it seems to me is that this gentleman or gentle lady is interested in poor treatment compliance of a certain disease. I can figure that out. I would have asked her to write this as an aim. But I want to understand poor treatment compliance in diabetic patients, for example, or whichever patients. And then they should have mentioned the research question. What is treatment what are the factors that affect treatment compliance in so-and-so disease, in so-and-so problem? And then within the objectives, I can clearly see that among the factors, this person is very, very interested in comparing alcohol and economic status. So I would have advised that person that, look, write your specific objectives. Number one, that you investigate or identify the factors or explore the factors, whichever you go with the poor treatment. And number two, give an analytical twist to it. And now make a hypothesis and predict that whether alcohol consumption leads is a better predictor of poor treatment compliance than economic status. You know, so there are multiple questions that are ways in which this research can be done. Do not combine them. You are wasting your own talent and you are wasting funders' time and space. This is a very intelligent research question. This is at least 4 to 5 objectives embedded within. And you can only do that if you follow the principle. Okay, Anil's question, remind me that I'll take Anil's question later on. We'll just bind up this slide and it will be open for questions. In the meanwhile, if you have questions, keep on writing in the chat box and we'll take it after this a couple of slides. Sometimes there are ambiguous aims, you know. The research aims to investigate treatment compliance and one, alcohol to economic status. Now this person is really short of words. Sometimes we do this because we come from very, you know, our mother tongue is not English. And sometimes we think that, therefore, I want to express in the way I think about it. If your mother tongue is not English, and I'm saying this with full responsibility, it's sometimes advantageous if you do not come from a traditional mode of thinking, because in academic language, the language is completely different from the traditional and technical or fluent English language that people use. So use it to your own advantage. That means what? That means that this can be learned. This can be learned. Okay. So if you were talking about aim, you should have given a bigger sentence and said that the research aims to investigate treatment compliance in XYZ patients with XYZ drugs, specifically in relation to alcohol and economic status. This could be a general aim. And even within this general aim, the research question should see PICOT. Which person, and you respecify that. You should also give value to the final and then make a final research question about it. And finally, the other mistake that people do is they mix research questions with objectives. They're completely different. Okay, the research aims, for example, research aims to investigate factors associated with treatment compliance. More specifically, it aims to do this and that. And this is a big problem. You already have your starter research question in the first line. To investigate what are the factors associated with treatment compliance. That was your starter research question. You should have written your starter research question. Step 2, you should have written your PICOT and Kipling questions. Step 3, you should have thought about whether you want to go through an analytical route, and then you have that in your mind, or through the descriptive route, and restated that sentence to make a good research question. Then the next part is actually objective, and this could have come within the objective, and you should have chronologically arranged that through a logical sequence. So if one could have been to investigate the factors, second could have been whether alcohol consumption is associated or not, or it could be the first as well. The third one could be whether economic status is associated or not. The fourth one could be whether alcohol consumption is more a greater predictor of poor treatment compliance than economic status. So there could be many ways in which you could have approached it, but mixing research question objectives, having ambiguous aims, and combining aims and objectives is something that is not standard. If you do not want to write your aim, do not write it. If you do not want to write your primary, secondary, all those objectives, do not write it. Write specific numbered objectives. That is fine. Objective 1, 2, 3, 4. That is fine. Or some people take the approach of primary objective and then secondary objective. Primary objective means that the main objective that you are studying. Secondary objective is, the things that you'll have to do to achieve primary objectives. The ancillary objectives, I'll also see those outcomes. I'm not interested in those outcomes, but I'll see them. So those are secondary objectives. Sometimes you don't have them. Aims are only to be stated if your guidelines say so. Otherwise, I see aim as a waste of time. Research question is more important than aim. Why? Because if you think in terms of research question, that is what your background tells you. You identify your problem area, poor glycemic and diabetes. You're thinking in terms of question. Okay? And I always say that to my researchers as well, because in medical research, this is a problem. People don't state research questions. And they have a massive problem when they're doing big research. So research questions should be stated first and should be very specific, very final type research question. Because if that research question is good, the funder looks at it. Even if your objective is not correctly framed, the funder tells you tweak your objectives. Your research question has some more interesting objectives than the ones you're framing. You understand? So therefore, research question framing is essentially different, distinct, and arguably more important than framing your research objectives, unless you're talking about a research protocol of thesis research or some small research. Okay. I'll throw an exercise here, and I'm not taking answers. And in the meanwhile, I'll take up some of the questions in the chat. So Anil asks, based on the hypothesis testing and descriptive, how to formulate research question. Based on hypothesis testing and descriptive. I wonder what you mean by descriptive here, because whenever you have a hypothesis, the type of research cannot be descriptive at all. If you are stating a hypothesis, then you are saying something like, let us say, drug X versus drug. Let me give you an example. I do have an example here. Look at this particular slide in this terms. Now, these are just hypotheses. If you say drug A causes no difference in blood pressure in patients, and again, this is a very badly framed, we should, I've written this in our book downstairs, is drug A reduces blood pressure in patients suffers from all three issues. So for example, it should have, 100 mg the dose, what BP reduction are we talking about, all of those things. But for the sake of this discussion, if you have a hypothesis where you are saying the drug A reduces more than drug B, then your research question is already a confirmatory research question. It is an RCT that you're doing. So it is an RCT design. Okay? So your objective should be to determine the difference in reduction of blood pressure, bracket, more than 10 mmHg, between drug X, drug A, and here it's not written, but it's, okay. So for the first one, it's non-directional that I see, in the sense that we do not know whether we are comparing it with placebo or not. So I can have the objective as to determine whether drug A to evaluate the efficacy could be here, to evaluate the efficacy of drug A in reducing blood pressure in patients more than 10 mmHg. Okay. It could also be to determine the effect on blood pressure reduction in using drug A with the dose and in what kind of patients. That is there. Now, if you see question 2, breakfast skipping has no association with obesity, and breakfast skipping is associated with obesity. Now here, it means that you have a directional hypothesis here. You're saying that breakfast skipping is associated with obesity. You have a direction here, and therefore, here you could have an analytical design and not an RCT. You can't do an RCT. You can't say to people that you skip breakfast. You skip breakfast twice a day, you skip twice a day. You can't do that. So what you do here is you do a cross-sectional study where or a cohort study where you see a lot of people, some of them are skipping breakfast, some of them are not skipping breakfast. Then through that you analyze, So it's an analytical research design, similarly, so on and so forth. I hope that I've been able to answer that research question, the question that Anil was asking. So step 1, state your research question. Step 2, use PICOT. Step 3, identify the type. Step 4, make the final research question. That is the first job. The second job, if you have a hypothesis, state your hypothesis. Okay? Once you've stated your hypothesis, now you will have clearer objectives. If there are no hypotheses, then that's not a problem. From research question, directly jump to the research objectives. So that is that. And there was another question. I'm doing preclinical study, animal study. And the same protocol shall I follow to formulate research question, hypothesis, objective? Yes. This is an interesting and a very important question. For all practical purposes, the guidelines are same. Where do the guidelines really differ? The guidelines differ in terms of, if you're still thinking about your research, the guidelines could differ in terms of your feasibility. Sometimes in some animal studies, the feasibility is higher. Okay, because you cannot, if you have diabetic patients, even if they suffer mildly from diabetes, you can't give them placebo. Probably in animal studies, you could. That is one of the things. The other thing is the ethics also differ. There are some stricter protocols in animal ethics as opposed to patient ethics in some regards, and so on and so forth. So this is where it differs, but in terms of research question, hypothesis and objectives, the standard guidelines are completely the same, and that is what I've tried to advise. Okay. Is there any other research question? Kindly explain non-inferior and superior. Okay, that's not part of our study, but now suppose that you have made a hypertensive drug, okay, and you are a big company, you are a big shop. Let's not take names of the brand names. And a lot of my students and researchers know how I love these pharma companies. Anyway, now you are trying to claim that I have a new hypertensive and I want FDA to approve it, and I'm doing a research strictly on that basis. Whether your drug is efficacious or not is not the question there. It's not the question. The question is whether your drug is substantially more efficacious than the other drugs in the market. Okay? So if I have a drug H that I've made for hypertension, and let's say there is a telmisartan there, I would say that I would keep a superior trial here, and I would say that my drug at the same dose or with lesser side effects or with a lower dose reduces blood pressure more than X, Y, and Z drugs that are available in the market. This is what I try to do. That is the best thing that I can do. But I will say that I have a superiority trial. This intervention that I'm doing is better than that intervention in terms of its potency or efficacy, in terms of its side effects, it would be lesser, So that is the kind of superiority trials that we usually do. Some of them are non-inferiority trials. Suppose that the drug market is very, very weak. COVID-19. We just had, let's say, one drug. We didn't have any. We know that even that drug, remdesivir, I knew from day one, and it's an open secret. Gilead knew from day one that remdesivir is not a very effective drug. Gilead knew it. Okay? And therefore, you would do a non-inferiority trial here. You would say that, all the available treatments that you have, my drug is as effective than your, FDA-approved drug. So here I would rather choose a non-inferiority trial. Okay? What difference does it make? The difference is on two things. One, the design is effective, and therefore, if you use a superiority trial, you have a good statement. The implication, the impact would be higher. You would be able to market the drug. Okay, you would be able to push that drug into your clinical guidelines every year. But the other difference is that the sample sizes of superiority trials would be higher. Okay? Because you're proving something. Whereas in non-inferiority trial, what you're trying to prove is that I'm as good as that. You're just saying that, in an interview, you're going with a superiority trial means that I am the best candidate, select me. In a non-inferiority trial, you're saying I am as good as everyone. It depends on what mode and what is the state of your children. So that is that. There are two new messages. How to evaluate efficacy of two comparative drugs. It really got I would want to know more about it. Why are you trying to compare it? So one comparison is you're trying to say that this is more efficacious. You have some literature somewhere where you saw that it is more efficacious. If it's only efficacy that you're talking about, go with the superiority hypothesis and make a research question like that. But sometimes it's about the side effects. That they're equally efficacious, but the side effects are lower in this one. Therefore, I want to prefer this one. Then it depends in the orientation through which we want to lead in the primary objective. Okay, Anil, thank you. I hope this was useful for people. I'll finally answer this question. Nobody has answered this yet. And we can wind up now. So in the next 5 minutes, we wind up. There's one question that I posed here. If anybody wants to answer this, Damisartan reduces blood pressure and has been newly approved. You want to test its efficacy in clinical patients. What should be your objective? I'm not asking research question because that is kind of a giveaway. What is going to be your research objective? Okay. So one thing is that in the research objective, again, now you become smarter, I presume. Your research objective is mean reduction in BP. That is one thing. Okay. One thing is that you're talking about mean reduction in BP, or probably you want to mean mean blood pressure. You have to be very specific about blood pressure, diastolic, systolic, mean. What are you talking about? Mean reduction. But I'm also asking about the verb that you should use to determine Damisartan's effect or in mean reduction of mean blood pressure by 10 mmHg in mildly hypertensive patients, or you could write hypertensive patients, and in bracket you could say less than the range of the hypertension that patient should have. So that is the within 2 months at what dose. All of this should be in your objective. Whereas the second question is Damisartan's test results claim that it additionally reduces mean blood pressure by 5 mmHg as compared to established drug Oldisartan. We had this. If this is your hypothesis and you saw the spirit example, here you should write superior, that to determine Damisartan's effect on blood pressure is is superior than the oldie sartan at what dose, in what patient you define that. And so that is the industry standard. The spirit protocol and the, I don't know what the construct one, but the spirit one clearly says that you should write your hypothesis within the objectives, non-inferior or superior, use that one. So that is that. And this is where to measure difference in mean blood pressure of mild primary hypertensive patients on dummy-sartan as compared to oldie-sartan. This is as good as it goes. Of course, I'm taking for granted, Dr. Basum, that you will also write the doses of those drugs because it's a big old thing. But yes, this is to measure the difference is also one of the robust work that we use. Okay, this is where I have this slide and I'll send this also. I'm going to send three things to you. One is this chart, and this is an intelligent book that Eric P. Green is writing. It's still a work in progress and it's free, Creative Commons. You see, this is a very interesting thing if you have this one pager where what is your research problem is you write, book, where are you entering? So diabetic glycemic control, state of knowledge, just 3 to 5 lines on what is available, probably poor glycemic control in younger patients, Naim et al. 2018, and 2-3 things there. What is the gap in knowledge? We do not know which age, whether there is a glycemic control difference. What is the critical need? Glycemic control is something that is related to mortality and morbidity, and therefore it's a given that it's a very important question. You write the long-term goal, the big picture, what, why questions, the rationale, all those things. Just 2-3 lines, title for aim, whether there is a hypothesis involved, supporting details, what kind of patient do you need? You need endocrinology patients, diabetes patients, so many of them, and what are the expected outcomes and impact. If you have this, and then you start refining your research question and your objectives, your grant proposal would be far better than you could have. So that is that, and I'll send those 2-3 things to you. And that's a thank you. There's one, compare the effects of dummy with oldie on systolic, diastolic, and mean blood pressure in male patients aged 40 to 60 years. Yes, this is as good as it goes, and I see that you are doing it. But I have one interesting question. Why male? I don't see your name here. It's Galaxy N30. But why male? And what is the problem in male? I have one phenomenon, which is a very big gap in research that we do. Even in the best research that we publish, we take care of one epidemiological factor known as confounding. There is another epidemiological factor, which the pharmacologists especially, and people who are researching in medicine, drugs, should be very aware of, and that is effect modification. And I'll tell you what, this has happened in clinical trials. 30 years ago, 30 years ago and beyond, all the clinical trials took these volunteer patients. Most volunteer patients were males. There have been clinical trials where there were no single female in the clinical trial. And you know what happened? The drug's effect was related to estrogen. We didn't know about it. I'll give you one very good example. Swine flu vaccine has different doses for males and females. How will you know that if you do not have a trial about it and if you do not have that population? That's why it is said that representativeness is extremely important. And it's not only related to gender, okay, it's also related to ecosystem. So if you do not have, let's say, Dalits in your population, because the population that is coming voluntarily to your medical college is completely different than the population that comes from a particular tribe who have different who are different ecosystem. They eat differently, their daily lives are different, then they could have a biological effect on that drug that we do not know of. So effect modification is something that gets affected when you needlessly take only males or only females or only old or only young, so that affects. So that is that, but that's not related to the research objective, that is fine. I would advise that compare word should be used only if you do not have any other word, and that's that. So thank you. I hope I made some sense, and I'll share it with you.
you so much, sir, for educating us on this topic. It was such an informative and wonderful presentation.